与和你。本期的节目嘉宾是我在纽约大学读书的时候，国际关系学院教授 Prof.James 他是世界政策研究所23年的高级顾问。今天我们将会一起讨论时下热点话题：外国留学生在美问题、特朗普外交政策、美国社会、新冠疫情升温、中美关系等等。Hi, Professor James. Glad to talk with you. My first question want to focus on the F1 international students H1B working visa. What's Trump's foreign policy? Please share us more information about that.
Well, as you probably know, since the beginning of the Trump administration, he's been strongly anti-immigrant, more anti-immigrant than any president in recent memory. And certainly the situation has gotten worse in recent months, especially for Chinese students and scholars. We know that the policy has been changed so that instead of having about a 6% rate of H-1B visa rejection, we now have a much higher rate. It's debated what the rate is. There's different estimates, but it's gotten considerably higher. So what they're trying to do administratively is just deny a lot of candidates for visas that used to be accepted. All right. And if there is a new administration, I would expect that things will go back to normal, in part because this policy has met with protests, particularly from American business organizations like the American Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers and others who depend on visas for foreign workers, foreign students, and foreign scholars to come to the United States and contribute their talents to American businesses. So I do expect that this is, although conditions have gotten bad, that these are temporary and will not outlast the Trump administration. That's it.
US-China always been a popular topic. Due to the current situation, do you think we really entered the Cold War, or you are facing something bigger?
This is a very big question, especially if you start to put it in the broader framework of what's happening, broadly speaking, in US-China relations. A lot of people are talking about the idea that there's a new Cold War between the United States and China. I discount that. In fact, I wrote a recent blog saying no new Cold War, because what we are actually seeing is President Trump realizes he's down in the polls. At present opinion conditions, he's not likely to be reelected president. So he's very worried about trying to find some issue or some way to galvanize the public and to get reelected. So I think one of the things he's thinking is if he can polarize relations with China, if he can try to show himself a very vigorous, tough guy on US-China relations, that somehow that'll boost his opinion ratings with the American public. And I think each of these issues reflects that. Again, these are issues that I think are peculiar to Trump, and not only peculiar to Trump, but peculiar to these last few months of the Trump administration, when he's desperately trying to win re-election, and right now looks like he can't do it. Now, taking the issues one at a time, delisting of Chinese companies from the stock markets. This has been threatened, but so far the action is somewhat limited. The problem is this would actually have negative consequences for American investors, at least as much as the companies, because when those stocks are traded in New York, there's a lot of jobs for American stockbrokers, for investment bankers, for people who deal in the stock and investment business. This is one of the reasons why New York has a lot of high-paid employment, because we have a lot of people dealing with international financial stocks. If large companies like those in China move their listings to other places, they can do that. They could list stocks in Hong Kong, they could list them in Dubai, they could list them in Europe, they could list them in other places. However, that means loss of American jobs, because that means that the trading business will go to those places instead of the United States. It doesn't mean that those stocks will be less traded. Investors, American or not, who want to buy those stocks will still do it. They'll just do it through other agencies than those in New York. And so it's really injuring Americans more than it's injuring Chinese, first of all. And it also, of course, will be then a bargaining point in terms of trying to get American business more access into China, particularly the financial business. This has been an issue on the table for a while. Actually, China's fairly willing to do it, but they want to be assured of some reasonable, equitable treatment from the United States in return. And so far, the Trump administration has only been willing to make demands and no assurances of equal treatment. So right now, where it stands, the question of South China Sea, again, this is an issue that's been around for a long time. There's nothing new in the issue. China has not made any new moves in recent years. Most of what they did in terms of building up certain small islets took place years ago and hasn't substantially changed. All the countries in the region that dispute the borders of the South China Sea have potentially legitimate claims, but the United States has no claims in the region. So it's not really an issue directly for the United States in the sense that however the issue is resolved, the United States is not claiming any part of the South China Sea. All the United States wants is that the issue be peacefully resolved and that there not be, armed conflict over it. That's an American policy. But as far as how the South China Sea gets divided up among the various countries that claim parts of it, there's never been a stated American policy on that. My view is it hasn't changed much. The situation is similar as it has been for a number of years now. And the only thing new is that Trump has been making a bigger issue of it, in part, again, because he wants to highlight his supposed tough guy persona and emphasize his strong stand against Chinese claims. But in fact, I think it's mostly empty words. Not much has really changed on the ground, and it's not really pushing the various claimants closer into any kind of settlement. It's not offering any way out of the current and, in fact, long-standing dispute over the South China Sea. And finally, I think all of these issues will look different in a new administration because a new administration will deal with these the way that American presidents have traditionally dealt with them, which is on the basis of mutual consideration and deals worked out on the basis of each side giving some and taking some degree of diplomatic back and forth. These are all relatively easy to solve problems. They've just been made into bigger problems because the Trump administration is trying to make a strong case for its own reelection rather than solve diplomatic problems.
So far this year, we have been witnessing BLM protests all across the country. Do you believe the U.S. is so divided right now?
America is not as divided as it appears if you look at the media. In fact, in many polling data, wide majorities of Americans agree on a lot of policies. The reason why things look divided, more divided than they really are, is because of bad leadership. When the leadership of the country, such as President Trump and many now in the Republican Party, tries to incite division, surprisingly enough, they succeed. And people do become more polarized. But it's pretty clear that the majorities are on the side of unity and cooperation and solving problems, not on the side of divide and incite. And so, again, this is an issue where I think what we're seeing is rather unique to the Trump administration, and it will not continue after the Trump administration. I think in particular, if Joseph Biden is elected the next president, as now looks likely, that he will try to bring people together again. Certainly he's campaigned on that. His personality, his political history suggests that he's aiming to be more of a unifier than divisive. I don't think a lot of the divisions are really that deep when you look at the polling data underlying people's real sentiments. But they've been pushed into a more extreme partisanship by the nature of the current leadership. Thanks.
COVID-19 coronavirus has been spread all over the world. What's the performance of the U.S. during this global pandemic?
Unfortunately, the U.S. response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been among the worst in the world, and many Americans are deeply unhappy about it. That's reflected also in public opinion polling. And probably the only other major country that has a similarly bad record right now is Brazil, whose president, in fact, recently came down with a COVID-19 infection after having, like Trump, disregarded the importance of it early on. So I think that the numbers speak for themselves. The U.S. response has been more tardy, has been slower. Another big difference is the relative lack of public discipline. That is, the public is not entirely willing in every part of the country to cooperate with reasonable public health regulations. I was in China itself when the outbreak became widely public there in January 24th. And I noticed an immediate response by the Chinese public, even prior to the official lockdown of different areas. That is, immediately the Chinese public responded by staying home, wearing masks, even when they weren't required to. They responded to the emergency. On the other hand, you had Americans, many of whom thought that this was fake, or they were told by the leadership that this was fake, that it wasn't a real problem, that the problem was minimized. So this is another area where public policy matters a lot, and the leadership mattered a lot, because so many Americans then began to see it as a partisan issue for a long period of time, a number of months, and treat it as if wearing masks was weak or somehow made you less self-confident, perhaps. And that's unfortunate, because almost every other country in the world saw it for what it is, a dangerous pandemic that's best dealt with by taking reasonable precautions. And with reasonable precautions, we also would have suffered less economically. As it turns out, we just got the economic figures out, and we have had our worst quarter for economic performance in the entire history of the United States over the past 3 months. And that's primarily due to the laggard response to the coronavirus and the lack of public response also to the economic and employment crisis. So we have both a severe crisis and a severe economic crisis and a severe pandemic crisis. Whereas some countries that responded quickly, for example, South Korea, Taiwan, China itself, and New Zealand, many others, they quickly flattened the curve. The public cooperated and reduced infection rates by taking precautions like mask wearing, social distancing, staying home when they could. And, you know, the disease was contained. It's still a problem even in those countries. And so it hasn't been 100% defeated, but it has been much contained compared to the severe circumstances now affecting the United States. And those consequences will have long-term effects, both to public health and to the economy. That is, the US economy will be more badly hit than probably any other in the world as a result of poor leadership and slow response to a serious public health emergency. I wish it were otherwise, but unfortunately that's the case.
Let's talk about something interesting. Donald J. Trump, Joe Biden, who will be the next president of the United States?
This is an issue that I've blogged about, I've been interviewed on TV about, and I've spoken in lectures since 2017, and I've been very consistent in saying that Trump will not be able to get reelected. Now it's becoming more obvious to most people that that's true, but I was arguing it even back in 2017 because I was confident that Trump lacked the ability to deal with the economic crisis that I knew would be coming under the Trump administration and the various foreign policy crises that his own policies would incite. He's someone who can bluster a lot, who has a lot of hostile words and tough language he can use, but unfortunately he's not clever enough. He doesn't have enough finesse to be able to solve the problems that he can talk about. He can talk and talk and talk, but he's never shown an ability to really solve problems. And that's now become obvious to the American people, particularly with the corona epidemic, when his response to it has been a disaster compared with almost every other country in the world, as we already mentioned. But also because of the various foreign policy crises, trade crises, and so forth, that he has been unable to solve despite putting a lot of priority on them. And so he just stops talking about it. He pretends that it'll go away if he doesn't talk about it. This is the way he deals with a lot of problems. He tries to exaggerate them, bring them up to a head, and then if the other side backs down, great, he can claim it as a victory. In international relations, more often than not, what happens is he doesn't get his way, and then he has to back down or ignore the fact. And this indeed is happening also in US-China relations. He supposedly had a trade deal. I said I blogged at the time saying it's a fake deal. It's not a real deal. It's just an effort for him to try to claim something so he could get reelected. But that deal is already plainly broken down. All right. So again, everything he's tried to do, he's failed. The only one success that he has was in cutting taxes. And unfortunately, that's not very popular with the American people because mostly he only cut the taxes of very rich people. So most people didn't feel any benefit from that. So I always expected that it would be very tough for Trump to get reelected. And I've said that in public numerous times and explained why. What I didn't expect, of course, was this pandemic. I would have predicted that given a pandemic, his response would be bad. And it has been. It has been, if anything, worse than I could have guessed. But I didn't expect this is the sort of thing that he could handle because he hasn't shown himself able to handle science or to handle diplomatic problems very easily. So consequently, I think there's now no chance for Trump to get reelected. And in fact, I think not only will he not get reelected, but it's very likely now that his party, the Republican Party, will lose control of the Senate. And so that 2021 will see Joe Biden as a Democratic president and Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate, allowing the Democratic Party to reverse a lot of the things that Trump has done during his 4 years. Thank you.
Based on experience and knowledge, who is the best U.S. president to solve the global affair issues?
I think there's no question that the greatest American president in terms of foreign policy was Franklin Roosevelt, in part because he faced the biggest challenges of any president in recent history, or even going back to the early history of the United States. Obviously, part of that was the Great Depression, which wasn't so much a foreign policy issue, but it did involve foreign policy because it involved international cooperation to try to recover from the Great Depression. And he did do things in that area, including introduce the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which is still a major part of American foreign economic policy to this day. He also introduced greater cooperation in the areas of monetary policy, which have continued in the post-war period. He began the process of developing international institutions that ultimately evolved into the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the European Union, to help promote international cooperation in the post-war world. So there's so much of the current world order that actually originated in the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And I'm not saying these things were perfect. There were mistakes made. There are things that one could criticize, but certainly in terms of influence and effectiveness, no president of the United States has been more influential or more effective in achieving his goals than Franklin Roosevelt, in part because he had such big challenges. Of course, the biggest challenge was World War II, in which he helped the Allied powers while the United States was neutral. And then after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he entered the war and vigorously prosecuted it to the point where Germany and Japan and Italy were totally defeated. And then reconstructed, brought back into the world order as, in fact, friends and allies, trading partners of the United States. That also was a major accomplishment. Germany to this day, Japan to this day, remains a friend, an ally, and a valued trading partner of the United States. Very few countries have faced such great challenges and come away from them with so much success as Franklin Roosevelt did during his long 12-year administration.
Thank you, Professor James. I think we have a wonderful discussion of international relations. I hope you have a lovely rest of summer. Keep safe and stay healthy.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here. My pleasure.
和 Professor James 的对话又让我回想起了当年选择国际关系这个专业那种炙热的情感。正是这份热情促使我始终追寻梦想的感觉，想要让更多的人听到我的声音，一起来更好地理解和改变我们身处的世界。无论世界怎样纷繁复杂，无论国际形势如何风云变幻，我们始终追求客观，希望站在互帮互助的角度上看待世界上各国的和平崛起。 我们求同存异，朝着更开放、包容、共赢的方向发展。面对全球格局，是互相对抗还是寻求国际合作？希望能做出正确的选择。在新冠疫情肆虐的当前，中美关系再一次成为了焦点。双方在近几年由合作为主转为合作与斗争并存，矛盾冲突不断加剧的局面已经引起世界各国的担忧。在当前世界面临空前大灾之际，更需要全人类同心协力，共克病魔。我们相信世界主流仍然会是和平共处，这也符合中美双方和全世界的根本利益。作为年轻媒体人，我希望可以传递正能量的世界观，推动开放，建立桥梁。